This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I feel I'm among friends already because I've met two research students, one of whom is working on English public schools, and they will feature very rapidly in this talk, and another of whom is working on the East End of London, and that is going to be very central to the talk as well. So I feel I've come to the right place this afternoon. What I want to do is talk about three intellectuals and their relationships and what they might tell us about the origins of the welfare state. And perhaps if I have some time at the end and you'll indulge me, we might talk a little bit about the nature of English intellectual life and indeed English elite society, perhaps in a comparative way, because I think these three are rather interesting examples of a kind of phenomenon in British life that defines the British elite, and I think it may be different in France, and that would be interesting to me to hear your reflections. So first of all, we better see who they are, and this is the slideshow. This is the only slideshow, but this is a young William Beveridge, and I thought I'd show you images of them when they were young and when they were a bit older as well. So this is Beveridge, probably in his early 20s, I would guess. Now, how do we move it on? It's not doing quite what I expected. Try that, okay. This is William Temple, as you'll see, of course, a churchman. Temple, I have to say, always looked about this age. It doesn't matter whether you see an early photograph or a late photograph, he always looks the same. And that's Tawney. That was taken in 1909, which made him 29. He was born in 1880. And then later, that's Beveridge as an old man, probably about early 1950s, after his great report. And that's Temple as a bishop. I think that's when he's Bishop of York. I'm not sure. He might have gone to Canterbury already. I'm not good on the robes of the Church of England. And then finally, that's Tawney. He lost all his hair in the 1920s when he was very closely involved with the Labour Party. There may be some connection there, but anyway. So that's who we're dealing with. We'll leave Tawney there. Okay. Now, this talk has several points of origin, and it really derives from a biography of Tawney that I wrote, as Fabrice said, and published 3 years ago. But along the way, as I was working on that, I began to realise that actually what was more interesting was the relationship between these three, because it opened up other sorts of questions beyond the limitedly biographical. And they were friends throughout their lives. They met in Oxford in 1900 and 1901. And looking at them as a trio, I think now tells us rather more perhaps than is the case in just looking at them individually. The talk also emerged out of a project that I was involved with when I was, as Fabrice explained, at the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. And over 10 years, we published more than 300 kind of group biographies, you might call them prosopographies, of people who acted together in British history. Obviously, the Dictionary of National Biography is a study of individuals, nearly 60,000 of them, but we were very conscious that obviously things are done in collaboration, and we wanted to try to make that point. And so if you know where to look on the Oxford DNB website, there are these reference group articles, many of them I think very interesting, on key groups throughout British history: intellectual, political, social, sporting, cultural. And in a way, this little project of writing about three people owes something to working on the concept of the group in history. Now, in choosing those groups, I have to explain that we were very careful only to choose groups who consciously acted together, who were aware of their group nature and who consciously acted, be it in a political sphere or a cultural sphere. It may be those poets who met in the Mermaid Tavern in London round about 1600, of whom Shakespeare was one, or it might be the Anti-Corn Law League, who in the 1840s propagandized for free trade, but they worked together. These three, of course, were friends, but they never consciously set out, as it were, to establish a welfare state or work together. So they probably wouldn't count as one of our groups. But nonetheless, they are, I think, informally worthy of consideration. The other point that I'd make about them, and that I'll come to in the course of the paper, is that when we think about welfare history, social reform, there are obviously a lot of conventional approaches that we might take, structural approaches, narrative approaches. But in this case, what I want to emphasize is not so much ideology, because ideologically these were quite different people, not also a methodology, not a particular way of thinking about society, because they differed, as I'll show, very considerably. But I think I want to emphasize temperament, because what I think differentiates these people and what I think comes through in thinking about them is that they were of a different temperament. Some things they shared, but in some ways, temperamentally they were similar, and temperamentally they were different also. And as I've said, at the end, I hope there'll be time just to say a little bit about the nature of the English elite, and compare it, perhaps in discussion, with the French intellectual and policy elite, and the differences in the way they are formed and the way they have been, in a sense, self-consciously involved in our two societies. So, R.H. Tawney, William Beveridge and William Temple were friends for more than half a century. Tawney and Beveridge were brother-in-laws. Tawney married Beveridge's sister, Jeanette, in 1909. And William Temple, who was a friend to both, was present at that wedding. And then much later, in 1944, he actually presided. He married William Beveridge when Beveridge married late in life. So their lives were intertwined in many different ways, and they had to negotiate these relationships with some discretion. Each of them wrote a famous work, a book of sorts, that shaped post-Second World War Britain. Equality, by R.H. Tawney, published in 1931. Christianity and Social Order, published in the midst of the Second World War, 1942, by William Temple, when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And then, of course, the eponymous Beveridge Report, always known in Britain as the Blueprint of the Welfare State, also published at the end of 1942. And interestingly, it was William Temple who first coined the term by which, in a way, British society ever since has been known. He coined the term welfare state in a pamphlet at the end of 1941. Tawney read in draft many of the books and pamphlets published by his two friends. When Temple died first in 1944, Tawney and Beveridge provided a great deal of information and reflection for Temple's biographer. Tawney read the whole of the biography by Ironmonger in draft. So we have a kind of nexus. And that three of the most notable intellectuals of the first half of the century in England, three founders of the welfare state, were so closely associated is itself, I think, remarkable. They shared many experiences, they inhabited the same spaces, and there was a kind of personal convergence. But as I've suggested, they also diverged in significant ways, and those divergences are revealing and I think important for a history of the welfare state and indeed the whole subject of temperament in politics. If we start with Tawney and Beveridge, they both came from families with strong, recent Indian connections. Tawney's father, Charles Henry Tawney, was a classicist, a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge in the 1860s, then an Orientalist who became head of Presidency College in Calcutta, which is part of the University of Calcutta. And Tawney was born in Calcutta in 1880, and he spent his first 5 years there. His father became a noted translator of Hindu epics and stories, and then when he returned to England became the librarian at the India office in London. Beveridge's father was a district sessions judge in the Indian civil service. Josie Harris, in her biography of William Beveridge, describes Henry Beveridge, his father, as shy, gentle, introspective and self-deprecating, and by temperament a scholar and antiquarian rather than a lawyer or public functionary. Really, the only divergence in their fathers was that Tawney Sr. was the scholar and antiquarian that Beveridge Sr. wished he'd actually been. Very similar fathers in that respect. William Beveridge, known as Will to his friends, was also born in India at Rangpur in Bengal in the year before Tawney, so 1879, and he also returned to England as a small boy. And both families actually settled within a few miles of each other in Surrey, to the south of London, though they didn't in fact know each other, the families, until their children became acquainted. Now, both men, William and William Beveridge, Harry Tawney, had to contend with William's mother and later Harry's mother-in-law, Annette Susanna Beveridge. She was a very brilliant but also manipulative woman. George Bernard Shaw, the great English playwright, wit, writer, George Bernard Shaw described her as the cleverest woman of my acquaintance and the wickedest in her opinions, which is quite some accolade coming from Shaw. She was a gifted linguist and translator in Oriental and modern languages. She has her own Oxford DNB entry, so she's a significant figure in her own right. And she wanted her daughter to marry a man of means, and R.H. Tawney, when he proposed to her daughter Jeanette in 1908, had only just finished a 2-year kind of postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Glasgow. He was hoping at that point that Oxford would appoint him to be the first tutor of a new experiment in workers' education in 1908. But he had little to his name at this stage, and Annette Beveridge opposed the match, even using an argument from Edwardian eugenics to try to thwart the marriage, because Tawney had a severely handicapped elder brother who was institutionalised. And of course, in a eugenics view of the Edwardian period, this might have implications, as it were, for their offspring. And eventually she came to, not least through the actions of William Beveridge, Harry's friend, of course, from college, who stood up for his friend and indeed for the marriage in general. Temple's origins, however, were slightly different. He was born into the highest levels of the English social and intellectual elite. His father, Frederick, was one of the leading churchmen of the Victorian period. William of Temple, our Temple, is often described as the greatest churchman of the 20th century in England. His father was, if not the greatest Victorian churchman, one of the most notable, because Frederick Temple became Archbishop of Canterbury, as William Temple, his son, would later on. Temple's mother was a woman called Beatrice Lascelles. She was the daughter of an MP, and that MP, William Lascelles, was a younger son of the Earl of Harwood, and his mother was the daughter of the 6th Earl of Carlisle. So I hope you're getting an impression of an English aristocratic family with strong intellectual and religious connections. You can get a sense of home life among the Temples from something that William Temple wrote of his mother in 1915. I hope you can pick up the references here. He wrote this: "There was a spaciousness of mind about my mother and others of her generation, which I don't think modern methods and girls' colleges tend to produce. No doubt Girton College, Cambridge, or Somerville College, Oxford, is better than home for most. But to be about the place from childhood on with Gladstone, Dizzy, Harcourt, Matt Arnold, Balfour, must have been better still." So this is the kind of world in which his mother grew up, where prime ministers, great intellects, poets, and so forth came to have salon conversation. So Temple's background is very singular and slightly different. But the three boys were sent to major public schools, Beveridge to Charterhouse, Tawney and Temple to Rugby. They were all high-flying classicists, though Beveridge was also a very fine mathematician. If Tawney and Beveridge spoke and wrote little about their experiences at school, I think it was for different reasons. Tawney, who seems to have enjoyed his life at Rugby and made good friends there, again notable friends, Arthur Ransome, the author of Swallows and Amazons, famous English teenage or children's fiction book, and the son of the great editor of the Manchester Guardian, C.P. Scott, his son Tom. Those were Tawney's friends. Tawney played sports, won all the prizes, and in many ways seems to have enjoyed himself. But Tawney, of course, spent the rest of his life campaigning against the public schools and calling for their abolition. Beveridge, on the other hand, was a weak and spindly swot, as we say, somebody who was obviously very clever and had his head in his books, and he was largely ignored when he wasn't being bullied at Charterhouse. So for Beveridge, I think when he went to Balliol College, Oxford, it was a deliverance, but for Tawney it was just the next step, because the cleverest classicist at Rugby School always went on to Balliol, and that is where the two men met in the first weeks of the new term, the new academic year, in 1899. Temple was a year younger. He went up to Balliol College, where his father had been educated before him in 1900, a year later. There's a sort of legend, which has been repeated in many places, that the two boys, Tawney and Temple, met as new boys on the platform at Rugby railway station on their first days at school. But in fact, in reality, they didn't know each other. They were in different houses and different years until the two families, the Tawneys and the Temples, went on a summer holiday in the Lake District, and they, as it were, got to know each other at that point. Tawney later explained in a memoir of Temple that he spent the summer following the usual exploits of boys, fishing, catching butterflies, that sort of thing. Temple, on the other hand, was reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So, again, a slight difference. Now, as Josie Harris has described in her biography of Beveridge, Harry and Will were part of actually a circle focused on the charismatic, though doomed figure, a man called Arthur Collins Carey, who some years after leaving Balliol committed suicide. There was a degree of a sort of homoeroticism in their circle, although there's no reason to believe that it was more than just a kind of atmosphere. But as time went on, Tawney became much more serious-minded and more socially conscious, and with Beveridge, the two of them shared a kind of growing interest in social and economic issues, and they founded a society early in 1902 for the writing of papers on social questions. It didn't seem to meet more than once, perhaps because Tawney gave a paper on the taxation of site values, very arcane bit of Edwardian taxation policy, and that must have killed it off to begin with. Nobody would come after that. But Tawney was in earnest, and he joined at Oxford the Independent Labour Party, which had been founded somewhat earlier in the 1890s, 1893, and was a precursor of the main Labour Party, founded a few years later. Temple, by contrast, inherited his family's conservatism, though by about 1906 he'd shaken that off, the year that the first Labour MPs were elected to Parliament. Temple by then had become a Labour supporter. But like Tawney, and Tawney was very involved, of course, with the Labour Party, particularly in the 1920s, when he was a kind of central intellectual figure in its committees, and he wrote the 1929 Labour election manifesto. Rather like Tawney, however, Temple grew somewhat disillusioned with the party in the 1930s, disappointed in its parliamentary achievements and critical of Labour's foreign policy in the 1930s. The Labour Party certainly sought out Temple's endorsement when he was Archbishop of York in the late 1920s and 1930s, and then, of course, Archbishop of Canterbury, but he generally kept himself at arm's length from the party, never wishing to be captured by it. Now, the great difference, I think, between Beveridge and Tawney at Oxford was their manner of leaving the university. Beveridge got a first-class degree in Greats, which only a very small handful of students each year would get. 3 or 4 in a year at Oxford would graduate with a first-class degree. But Tawney, who was regarded as surpassing brilliance, he got an unexpected second-class degree. Now, his father, a great classical scholar himself, was dismayed and apparently wrote to his son, "How do you propose to wipe out this disgrace?" The master of Balliol College, a man called Edward Caird, a philosopher, suggested rather more charitably that though Tawney's mind was chaotic, the examiners that year ought to have seen that it was the chaos of a great mind. Tawney tried to shrug it off. I found a very nice letter in which he claimed to feel a kind of sympathy for his examiners. Beveridge went on immediately to a fellowship at University College in Oxford, and while holding it, he took up residence in Toynbee Hall, the social welfare settlement in London's East End, where students, graduates, intellectuals, men of social conscience went to work with the poor in the poorest districts of London. But a college fellowship, which was thought to have been the next stage for Tawney, was closed to Tawney because he didn't get a first-class degree. And after some months in Germany learning the language, he returned to England and he joined his friend in Whitechapel, where he spent the next 3 years running something called the Children's Country Holiday Fund, which sounds quite a small affair, but actually it sent 40,000 of London's poorer children into the countryside for holidays every summer. They would go for 2 weeks and they would board with families in villages all over the south of England. And it was quite a job to organise this and raise money from the bourgeois and aristocratic supporters of these kinds of ventures. And that's what Tawney spent 3 years doing, running the Children's Country Holiday Fund. It was still in existence in the 1950s, in fact, so it wasn't a small enterprise. Beveridge, in fact, became sub-warden of Toynbee Hall and somebody who was a mentor to many of these Oxford graduates who went into the East End, a man called the Reverend Samuel Barnett, a very notable figure in religious and intellectual circles in London from the late 19th century onwards. And it was whilst he was there in Toynbee Hall that he began economic and social research that led to his first great book, Unemployment, A Problem of Industry, in 1909, an analysis of the defects of the London labour market and labour markets in general, which had an important influence over thinking and then policy in Britain, dealing with unemployed and the finding of jobs for surplus labour. And yet, and this is important, both men became disillusioned with what they were doing at Toynbee Hall, considering that the attempt at moral uplift in the slums of London was bound to fail. And I think it's in dealing with that recognition of failure that discovery that soup, good works, kindness, charity, high-mindedness, Christianity, this complex of approaches to the problems of poverty would not work, that the divergence between Tawney and Beveridge really began, and that's an important theme. Temple was a more bold figure in Oxford. He was more socially active, and he was more successful than the other two. They were notable figures in Balliol, but Temple played on a bigger stage. He became president of the Oxford Union Society, the famous debating society, and he moved effortlessly after he had got his first-class degree in Greats to a tutorial fellowship in philosophy at the Queen's College in Oxford, down the road from Balliol, and he held that for 6 years. He also went into the East End. He spent time at 3 of Oxford's settlements. It wasn't only Toynbee Hall, there was also Oxford House, and there was indeed an Oxford medical mission in Bermondsey as well. So you can see that they're very much part of this project to send elite men into the slums of East London. But he diverged in a very crucial respect from his two friends because he took holy orders. He became a priest in the Church of England. This was in fact not automatic. It was very troublesome for him because his father, of course, preceded him as Archbishop of Canterbury. But Temple, I think it's fair to say, never believed in the central doctrines of any Christian church. He didn't believe in the virgin birth, and he didn't believe in the resurrection of Christ. But eventually, a form of word, a very modern churchman, there are many in the Church of England today, I think, about whom that could be said, but not in 1908. Eventually, a form of words was found, and the then Archbishop of Canterbury said, yes, it was okay, and he became a priest. But he never really believed in what you would consider to be central to Christian faith. Now, if we take stock at this point, the trio have experienced remarkably similar lives. Public school, Balliol, Greats, classics to you and me, the East End of London. But I think Temple's decision to go into the church and then, in fact, to become headmaster of Repton School, another famous public school in England in 1910, where he stayed for 3 years, and of course the subsequent career in the church, puts an end to the sort of close harmony we've seen so far. It's certainly hard to see Tawney and Beveridge in holy orders, though Tawney was a Christian to the end of his life in a muted, modest sort of way, although his faith was, I think, quite profound at times. Beveridge is a much more secular figure, and neither Tawney nor Beveridge would ever have been schoolmasters, let alone headmasters running a school. That said, all three of them, I think, bear the imprint of a common education and a common purpose, and I think that purpose can be summed up in the words of another late Victorian intellectual, W.G. Collingwood, a famous figure in English life who was Ruskin's secretary in the 1880s and the 1890s. Collingwood wrote this, and I think it sums it up rather well. The Greats School was not meant as a training for professional scholars and philosophers. It was meant as a training for public life in the church, at the bar, in the civil service, and in Parliament. The school of T.H. Green, and he was a famous Balliol philosopher, sent into public life a stream of ex-pupils who carried with them the conviction that philosophy, and in particular the philosophy they'd learnt in Oxford, was an important thing, and that their vocation was to put it into practice. In this perspective, though Beveridge went into government, Tawney into academic life, and Temple into the church, each, I think, took that same educational experience and the principles derived from it with them into public life. They moved in slightly different spheres, but there is a commonality there too. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1908, Tawney underwent a crisis over William Beveridge's sister, Jeanette. They had met in Oxford. She had been reading modern languages at Somerville College. They were close. They wrote each other letters. But Tawney, a reserved and austere figure in some ways, never showed much approaching direct affection for her. But in 1908, it would seem that Jeanette was proposed to, I don't know by whom, but by somebody else, and Tawney made a counter-proposal. And I won't go into the details. She havered, and she, in fact, rejected him at first, but he kept going, and eventually she relented, and she agreed to marry him. And I have to say, I think it was the mistake of her life, because she was, and she knew what she was. She was not an intellectual, she was not a great social reformer. She was a nice upper middle class girl from Surrey, and they still exist. If you go to England, you'll see them around. And she needed to be cherished and cared for and looked after. She didn't want to change the world. And Tawney, on the other hand, I think had an image of what marriage was drawn from his growing involvement, in fact, with a very famous couple in British history in this period, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Sidney and Beatrice Webb were the exemplars of the kind of intellectual partnership that a marriage could be, and they were, of course, almost the echt social reformers, the ones who all of this group looked up to, and they all knew the Webbs. Tawney was very impressed by Beatrice Webb, who he met for the first time in 1905, and he offered Jeanette an intellectual and social partnership. And they were very unhappy, is the truth, for the rest of their lives. They reached a modus vivendi, but it was never a happy union. So, in a way, Tawney and Beveridge have a kind of ringside seat, as we would say, at each other's personal lives. Will would have been aware of the problems of the Tawney marriage. And then, once they were both at the London School of Economics after the First World War, Beveridge, its director from 1919, Tawney at that stage just a lowly junior lecturer. They were obviously deeply aware of the complex kind of relationships that they were both in, because Beveridge had a slightly complicated private life as well, though I won't go into the details. And of course, being brother-in-law to the director must have had complications for Tawney as he rose to eminence, especially in the 1930s, when Beveridge rather foolishly took an impossible line against his staff, arguing that the professoriate of the LSE should not become involved in public affairs and politics, should not sully their scholarship by taking public positions. And if you can imagine the kinds of people who were professors at the LSE in the 1930s, you can imagine how impossible that was. Imagine saying that to Harold Lasky, for example. There were complexities in their relationship, both personal and professional, which I think meant that Tawney kept his distance from the internal workings of the London School of Economics, not wishing to clash or in any way intrude upon his brother-in-law's space. Nevertheless, there was never a hint of professional jealousy between them. And of course, Tawney climbed to the professoriate at the LSE by dint of his own great success, publishing in the space of a decade 3 of the most important books, we might say, published in England in the 20th century. The Acquisitive Society in 1921, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, a study of early modern economic history and economic thought in 1926, and then in 1931 his book Equality. Now, as is perhaps well known, Tawney also did something rather different. He volunteered in November 1914. In other words, he volunteered to fight in the army, believing, like Temple, that the British should fight in the First World War. Now, for Temple, this was about honour. We had to honour our treaty obligations to France and to Russia, and indeed to the Low Countries as well. Tawney, I think, had a different view. He believed that what he referred to in his letters as Prussianism had to be beaten. He meant by Prussianism, of course, external expansion and internal intolerance and illiberalism. But I think he also felt obliged to join up for another reason, because so many of the working men that he'd spent the last half dozen years teaching in the Workers' Educational Association were volunteering to fight in the British Army, Navy and so forth. And I think Tawney felt that if, as it were, he could teach these men, he jolly well could fight alongside them as well. Sergeant Tawney declined a commission. He didn't want to be an officer, he wanted to stay with the men. For years later, right to the end of his life, he would pad around his home in Bloomsbury in his sergeant's tunic. And he always said that the greatest accolade he ever received was to be a non-commissioned officer in the British Army. But he fought in France from late 1915. He was wounded in the first 25 minutes of the first day of the Somme offensive, July the 1st, 1916, left for dead, managed to crawl his way back to British lines. It was touch and go for several days, but he survived. And it's, of course, a great divergence. It's a great divergence, of course, that runs through British culture, and I'm sure French culture also, between those who fought and experienced the Western Front and everyone else. It was something that I don't think he could communicate easily to Beveridge, who didn't fight. Beveridge was physically unfit, and Temple, who remained a churchman at home. Tawney wrote a famous essay on his return, Some Reflections of a Soldier, which actually go into the problem of explaining what the Western Front was like to all those who never experienced it. Tawney and Beveridge corresponded throughout the war. Tawney, of course, wrote to his wife friendly, jaunty, optimistic letters, making light of all the privations and dangers, but he was much more direct and honest in his correspondence with Beveridge. And one of the interesting things that comes out of that correspondence, particularly a letter that he wrote on Christmas Eve 1915, Tawney, of course, could speak French. He'd been to the right schools, was a gifted linguist. He was the only man in his battalion who could speak French well. He loved the French, actually, it's worth saying that here, and he wrote about how he'd like to settle in France after the First World War, when the conflict was over. But because he was a French speaker, it was his job to procure alcohol for the men, for the officers as well. And so he wrote this letter to Beveridge on Christmas Eve 1915, with everyone, hundreds of British soldiers, completely drunk around him because he'd got the wine for them on Christmas Eve 1915. And what was interesting about the letter, a very long letter, is that he reflects honestly about the kinds of people he's surrounded by, the awfulness of the British officer class, who he thinks are not up to the game, who really are very poor leaders and strategists, but also the average Tommy, the average working man in uniform in the trenches, who were very unlike the working men that he had had experience of in Workers' Educational Association classes. He had taught the labour aristocracy, the elite of the working classes, and he made many friends among them, personal friends, and he began to realise that the working classes were not quite like this through his experience in the war. Differences between Beveridge and Tawney had first surfaced at Toynbee Hall. There, Beveridge focused his research on problems of unemployment and casual labour in the city, as I've said. Tawney was genuinely interested in the problems of the East End, but he could also see that the social question in Britain was changing from a concern with the unskilled, with the lumpen proletariat, to an interest in the newly organised, newly powerful working class in trade unions in the cities and towns of the industrial north. Now, when the young David Marquand was a Labour MP, an academic, historian, intellectual, biographer of Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, when the young David Marquand interviewed Tawney at the time of his 80th birthday, so in the 1950s, he asked Tawney what had made him a socialist, and Tawney replied, going out into the world and meeting working people, but not the working people in the East End of London. They were a subservient lot. The working people in Rochdale, in Lancashire, they were proud and they told you what they thought. Tawney found it easier to establish a relationship of equals with communities composed of respectable, independent, self-sufficient, skilled workers who wanted to study their own history as part of a process really of individual and indeed communal self-realisation. But he had no aptitude, he realised, for a kind of moral uplift among communities that often lack the capacity to be morally uplifted. He wanted to educate serious-minded people on terms of social equality. So spending time at Toynbee Hall helped Tawney find his vocation elsewhere. As he wrote to Beveridge in 1905, teaching economics in an industrial town is just what I want ultimately to do. And that ultimately is, I suppose, what he did do through the Workers' Educational Association and then eventually at the London School of Economics. And as I mentioned, he developed a legendary rapport with his classes, and he spent long periods with his students outside the teaching room in conversation and good fellowship. Teaching those classes to worker students was a kind of corollary of Tawney's political ideas that were set out in something he called his commonplace book, which is a kind of journal, a record of his occasional thoughts in the late Edwardian years, really 1912 to 1914. This has been published. It was edited by J. Winter and published in the early 1970s. And if you read it, you discover that Tawney really evoked a spiritual rather than a material socialism, a very English kind of socialism, of self-improvement through education rather than a socialism of redistribution. And the greatest influence on his thinking at this time, and indeed arguably the greatest influence on English socialism before the First World War, is John Ruskin, the Victorian art critic, commentator, later social critic, whose ideas you can clearly see reflected in Tawney's writing. Tawney, in fact, poured scorn in the commonplace book on Fabian socialism, the socialism actually of Beatrice and Sidney Webb, who he admired personally but disagreed with politically. Fabian socialism was very much in the ascendant. If you were a young intellectual in England before the First World War and a socialist, you would probably have been a Fabian, but Tawney was not. Fabianism promised to give the people better services and more of them, run efficiently by collectivist bureaucratic methods, when to Tawney the problem was one of moral ends and moral purposes, and Fabianism was just another species of materialism and utilitarianism. But that wasn't what Tawney wanted out of socialism. And this leads back to Beveridge, because although he was not a Fabian, he was never a socialist, he was a type of new liberal progressive, however. He too believed in centralised and bureaucratic solutions to social ills. And of course, this kind of approach to social ills made him, through the Beveridge report, one of the most famous men in Britain in the 20th century. And Tawney, as I've suggested, was intrinsically distrustful of this approach. The younger Tawney disavowed social welfare from above, handed down to the people. He preferred a working class able to claim what was its due by its own efforts. And this was what Tawney's nephew, who knew him well, a man called Michael Vivian, who was a historian at Trinity College in Cambridge, this is what he said about his uncle in 1981, and I actually knew Michael Vivian when I was young. Vivian said this: "For Tawney, socialism was the dream and culmination of a historical workers' movement, not a managerial imposition. Tawney was not sympathetic to scientific social democracy. He thought change had to come from below. He did not like authority and the state as it would be run by the Webbs any more than by Beveridge. He disliked the idea of a regime being imposed, and there was a good deal of anarchism in his makeup." Tawney supported state intervention in particular industries and in the regulation of the economy, but he was always less enthusiastic about state involvement in civil society. Here he remained, I think, a very Victorian voluntarist, an idealist in the tradition he'd learned at Balliol, the tradition of T.H. Green. And indeed it led to a last sad disagreement with William Temple over the future of adult education. Temple convened a conference in Oxford in 1944 to consider the future of workers and adult education after the war. And at that conference, Temple and his fellows endorsed the creation of a central government agency to oversee and coordinate further community education. But Tawney demurred. He opposed this. He didn't attend, and he wrote to say that he was against centralisation and state direction. The WEA, the workers, should remain self-governing and be a functioning model in themselves of a democratic society providing a democratic education. There was also a difference in their academic methods and their conceptions of their subjects. Beveridge always wanted to be seen as a scientist, and he hoped that economics and sociology would eventually be constructed on a scientific basis and be accepted as such. He used the term science frequently, whereas as far as I can see, Tawney never referred to science when he wrote about what he did and when he thought about the social disciplines in general. Economics for Tawney were always inductive, institutional, historical, never mathematical or theoretical. And there's testimony from some of his students to that effect. So that if you read Beveridge's autobiography, there's a section there on methodology of economics and the other social sciences in which he expresses his disappointment that during his lifetime the social sciences have not reached, as it were, the level of the natural sciences, and he used the model of biology. And indeed his intellectual framework in these terms was very much dependent on a lecture he referred to several times in this section of his autobiography, a lecture that T.H. Huxley, Darwin's famous supporter, gave in 1854. So you can see how, as it were, Victorian positivistic Beveridge's ideas on the nature of social science were. But Tawney was not at all like that. Indeed, if you read the Commonplace book, and indeed other things that Tawney writes, he took it as axiomatic that the purpose of sociology was indeed the improvement of human life, but that what it required at its basis was a kind of moral foundation. There's no point in having a science without morality. There was no point in having a social discipline, social investigation, social speculation without a kind of ethical foundation. And he was very clear that ethical foundation should be what he called the common property of Christian nations. There was a kind of simple Christian morality at the heart of everything Tawney did, though it's much more muted, of course, than in Temple's case. And as Tawney understood it, the point of sociology, the point of the social sciences, was to have a morality at their core, and indeed to spread that morality through their investigations and through their teachings. Lacking Tawney's historical sensitivity and emotional range, and I suppose also lacking his faith, his Christian faith and his faith in ordinary people, Beveridge was at his best in social research and the design of policy. Of course, we mustn't exaggerate. The Beveridge report, when it was published in November 1942, ignited enormous popular interest. It came, as you probably understand, at a turning point for Britain in the Second World War. It was published just at the point of the victory in the desert, El Alamein against Rommel, and it was also published just as Stalingrad fell and the news filtered into England, Britain, in December 1942. It was the turning point of the war, and the Beveridge report published then seemed to presage, as it were, a new world, a new Britain. when a war had been won. And Beveridge actually went on the stump, as we say. He went around Britain in 1943 holding public meetings to impress upon people the principles of the Beveridge Report and to set out a vision of a welfare state. So that we mustn't be, I think, too harsh on him. Meanwhile, even a cursory reading of Tawney's Equality shows a man who is not just a moral thinker and a critic of capitalism, but also somebody who can understand the technicalities of social reform and can engage in close analysis of industries and what would be required for their improvement and indeed their nationalisation. Temple, for his part, was really a public Christian, a public moralist who was best at compelling ethical lessons. In February of 1944, both Tawney and Temple spoke at a large public meeting of educational and labour organisations in London, designed in fact to press on towards the famous 1944 Education Act, which established the structure of British schooling for the next generation. Tawney recalled that Temple came late to the meeting and was greatly overburdened at the time, but he spoke simply, avoiding technical details, making no attempt to give the impression of special knowledge. The effect of his speech on the audience was due to his transparent sincerity and to the fervour of moral conviction with which he spoke. It was, I think, profound. And Beveridge said similar things about Temple during the war. In fact, Temple during the war was a remarkable figure, and his death in 1944 was felt as a national tragedy as a light went out in British life. Now, of course, both of these temperaments or approaches have been required in the process of 20th century social change. And intellectuals have played both roles simultaneously, that of the moralist and teacher on the one side and that of the strategist on the other. Tawney and Temple are on the one side, Beveridge on the other, and they're almost archetypal in these respects. They in a sense sum these different ways of working towards social change. And it would be difficult, I think, to think of three leading figures in the 20th century in Britain who shared so much and had so much in common origins, common education, common experiences and friends, common institutional affiliations, and even, as we've seen, lifelong family bonds. Now, it's customary to ascribe political differences to ideological differences, and in this case we do indeed encounter clear ideological differences between a socialist, Tawney, a kind of centrist, Temple, and a liberal, Beveridge. Beveridge was never a socialist, he was always some sort of liberal. Now, we generally explain ideology or ideological difference in biographical terms. We relate it to family background, upbringing, schooling, family wealth, profession, and so forth. But in the case of these three men, so many of these aspects of their lives were essentially similar. It would actually be difficult to find objective biographical reasons for their difference. And so I'd suggest that we're led to something anterior to ideology, something more deeply personal and internal rather than contextual. By temperament and instinct, Beveridge, Tawney and Temple were different, and that proved to be decisive in the choice of their respective methods and routes towards social reform. Now, I've got just a few more minutes, and I'd just like to speculate a little bit, if I may, about the nature of what I've said in regard to the way we might construct the British intellectual class in the early 20th century. I've used the term British there, and I know in the course of this talk I've switched between Britain and England constantly. In fact, I'd want to say that these three figures are quintessentially English, actually. There's not a great deal of British in their background. They're English and imperial. They're not quite British, and we might talk about that. But in 1955, the American sociologist Edward Shills wrote a very interesting article about the British elite. And this is what he said. He wrote about British intellectuals. He said, their union with the civil service, the church, the Houses of Parliament, the press, and the leadership of the political parties, through the ancient universities principally, but also through kinship and through the social and convivial life of London upper-class society, constituted a bond from which few could escape and which no other country could then or has since matched. And actually, I think Shills is right if we think about our three. Beveridge was a great civil servant. He mentions the church. Temple was the great churchman. The Houses of Parliament, I suspect all three of our figures were constantly in and out of Westminster talking to leading political figures. They wrote for the press. The leadership of political parties. Well, one of Tawney's closest friends, who could easily have been imported into this talk, was Clement Attlee. And Clement Attlee also had a very similar formation. He also went to Oxford. He also went to Toynbee Hall. He stayed in the East End and became a local politician in the East End, mayor of Poplar, and then went on to become an MP and lead the Labour Party and become the great post-war Prime Minister. I think Shills has captured the world that these three come from, and indeed the world, therefore, of English intellectuals. But I think it's a singular world, and I think Shills is right in that regard. I don't know a great deal about the French elite, which is why, in some ways, I'm interested to think about this in a moment with you. I know more about the American elite, and there is no equivalent, of course, in a democracy as robust and as complex as the American democracy was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in this period. Indeed, a great deal of work on American intellectuals has made the point that they were largely invisible. They largely retreated to the universities because the public sphere was so hostile to them, so difficult for them to control. They had none of the kinds of tentacular kinds of connections that allowed people like Tawney and Temple and Beveridge to function so successfully. The same might be said of the German elite in this period. Indeed, it's a great deal of work which I'm sure you'll be familiar with about German intellectuals, German liberal intellectuals in the late 19th century, the era of Weber and beyond, and their retreat into university life and into a kind of non-partisan scholarship in a German political system from the 1870s, which was hostile not only to their politics, but indeed to the very sense that intellectuals might have a role in the public sphere and in politics, somewhat similar to the role we've seen these three carving out. Now, if you compare these situations to the kind of situation I hope I've sketched for you this evening, the singularity of the intellectual class in Britain is, I think, evident. British intellectuals could retain their place at the heart of British culture and British institutions, even while espousing a reformist and sometimes unconventional politics. Fabian socialism in the Edwardian period really didn't involve displacement from polite society. And in how many societies was this true for serious socialists? In a very real sense, Beveridge, Tawney and Temple were men of the establishment who retained their social position and the respect of their peers even whilst they worked for fundamental reform of British society. In European societies since the Second World War, there's been a broadening of elites to encompass, I think, many different social backgrounds, types, political positions. But before 1945, Britain may have been singular. I'm not suggesting it was, but it may have been, in the relative pluralism, tolerance, and integration of its intellectual and political class, allowing these three, singly and together, to define and then lay down the principles and ethos of Britain's modern welfare state. But that is conjectural, and I just throw it out at the end, and you may disagree, but we'll see. Thank you.